And he was better, and he wasn't going home. He was trapped in this hospital. He saw days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into seasons. And summer and winter and spring and fall would all elapse, and he would still be sitting there. The doctors were getting concerned. They saw his morale going down. It was seeming that he was losing a sense of hope. And his mother was growing desperate. His whole family was growing desperate. I mean, can you imagine? We've all been at that place where the baby wants to come home. That's all they wanted. They wanted to care for him. But the bureaucrats were having meetings. Well, Jordan waited over 2.5 years in that hospital room before he finally died of what many people believe is a lack of hope. And what about his loving mother? Well, I've already shared with you that she had overcome her addictions, but you can imagine the stress of living apart from your children and then seeing your child literally die of a lack of hope in a hospital bed simply because of the color of his skin. And not, as a parent, be able to do anything about it. The family, of course, challenged the government. The First Nation challenged the government. But there is very little that forces the government to do anything. And so for Virginia, 6 months after her son died, found herself in a Winnipeg bus shelter, and she passed away from her addictions. Now, whose neglect is that? And what did this loving family do with that? Did they say we're going to sue the government of Canada and get a $10 million settlement out of them? They could have, but they didn't. They said, we want to honor Jordan's memory by never having this happen to another child. And with the help of Member of Parliament Jean Crowder, we have now something called Jordan's Principle. And Jordan's Principle is something all of you need to support. It's one of our 7 ways to make a difference. You can sign up for it. I'll give you those details. It takes 2 minutes. And what it is when a government service is available to all other children, and one of these crazy disputes crops up with a First Nations child, the government of first contact pays for the service, and then they can argue with the other level of government as long as they want about who pays who back. It is the Canadian thing to do. It is about fairness, it's about respect, and it's about putting kids first. On December 12, 2007, I happened to be in the gallery of Parliament. And it was the vote for Jordan's Principle, and as you can imagine, regardless of what political party you were in, all members stood in support of Jordan's Principle. And I was up in the gallery in seats much like these. And with a light like that, I was sitting in the shaded part, and I looked over to my left and I saw Ernest Anderson standing there. And as he saw them voting, I wondered, what was it that he could possibly be thinking? What would have you been thinking? All the members of Parliament stood and they kept applauding Ernest and his family and his nation for what they had done. And there was about 5 minutes, it seemed, that silence was there. And then Ernest Anderson rose and he walks over to the railing and he salutes them. If that's not reconciliation, I really don't know what is. We called on the Prime Minister that night to implement Jordan's Principle immediately, but of course they didn't do it. They didn't do it. They decided to narrow it to only apply to children with complex medical needs. They said, you know, really fairness and equality in education, well, that doesn't really matter. Fairness and equality in child welfare, that doesn't really matter. We're going to only narrow it to this very narrow population. And maybe the Prime Minister thought that there were no consequences. But on December 12, 2007, the Prime Minister had a chance to prevent another tragedy, and he didn't take it. You see, in another First Nation, there were two little children, Jacob and Sonia, and they had a terminal disorder. Their loving, loving parents were providing the very best care for them. But the government of Canada and the government of Manitoba were arguing over who should pay for the feeding tubes the children needed. Who should pay for the feeding tubes the children needed? Now imagine yourself a parent, being in the position of these two parents. Do you rewash the feeding tubes and risk infection to your child? Or do you not feed them? What choice would have you made? They chose to rewash the feeding tubes. And shortly after Christmas in 2007, their daughter passed away from an infection. And we don't know if it was related to the rewashing of the feeding tubes, but what we do know is that even after she passed away, the government of Canada continued to fight with her parents so that they wouldn't have to pay for the feeding tubes of their young son. You know, when we went and we asked Jordan's family what we might do as a collective for their family to honor them, they simply wanted to have a proper memorial for him, and so we took up a collection for a tombstone. And we eventually did the same thing for his loving mother. Do you know that I'm having to collect for another tombstone? For Sonia's tombstone. I don't want to do it anymore. Like, how many of them do I have to find? I even know how much the friggin' things cost. These kids died never knowing what it is to be treated like other citizens in this country because of their race. And it's wrong. And every day the Prime Minister puts us in the back steps, there's other stories like this family's all across this nation. And that's not the end of the inequalities these kids on reserve experience. As we heard the Chief talk about, education is one of those key things. Many people in post-secondary looked at someone like me, a status Indian, who's in university, and thought, you must have got the free ride ticket through post-secondary education. Well, the reality is I didn't get any money from Indian Affairs because there's such limited funding for people in post-secondary. But there's even a backstory you don't know, is that when you were in grade 1 and grade 2 off reserve, children on reserve were getting $2,000 to $3,000 less funding for their elementary and secondary school than you were. And the schools themselves are not places that we'd want to spend any of our time. You see, this school, you can see the pictures of these beautiful kids. This is Attawapiskat, Ontario. And that is, of course, 1,200 kilometers from James Bay. And you can see the kids are standing in front of a portable trailer there. There's another one. And the reason for that is that their school sits on a diesel fuel site contaminated by 30,000 gallons of diesel fuel. And when the children in the 1970s and 80s were complaining that they were getting sick, Health Canada would send in representatives but say there's not a problem. But of course in 2000, when the parents pulled their kids out of school, there was no other school to go to, but they made the courageous step of saying no more. Canada said, well, yes, this probably is a toxic dump, and so we should probably close the school. And what did they do? They brought in portable trailers, and they put the portable trailers on the playground of this contaminated school. What you're looking at there is the grade 4 portable, but when I went to Attawapiskat, the kindergarten portable was the closest one to the contaminated school. And so for the ladies in this front row, I could literally just toss a stone between where the 5-year-olds were learning and where that contamination was set.